Fellas, the UFC are having their 100th event in the Apex for a fight night this weekend. It's not their 100th event for the Apex, I'm pretty sure it's just their 100th Apex for a fight night. This weekend with UFC Vegas 100, have we got an absolutely monumental fight card to celebrate this? No, we've got a pretty mid fight night card. It's not terrible. It's not, it's not overly amazing. It's just a decent fight night, to be fair. Everything you could expect from an Apex. And I feel like that's the perfect way to represent the Apex. Not giving it an amazing card, because that would be that wouldn't be a perfect representative of the Apex. Giving it a bit of a mid fight night card is the perfect way to represent the Apex. But we're going to be breaking down every fighter competing on this card in UFC Vegas 100, as well as my prediction for every fight. For UFC Edmonton, we ended up going 8-4 on predictions. A couple of dodgy decisions on that card. I mean, Derek Lewis versus Dini's got pulled out as well, which is a fight that I'm confident I would have got correct as well. But I'll take 8-4. It could have been worse, could have been better, but 8-4 is not too bad. We'll start off with the first fight on this card, and we have Tresean Gore taking on Antonio Trocoli. Tresean Gore 1-2 in the UFC. And Antonio Trocoli lost his UFC debut to Sharapute Magomedov. Now, Tresean Gore had a bit of a weird career. 3-0 in his MMA career before he got sent to the Contender Series, where he ended up... got sent to the Ultimate Fighter, where he won on the Ultimate Fighter twice. Then he ends up losing on the Contender Series, but he ended up losing to Brian Battle, so it's not too much of a shame. And then he got brutally finished by Cody Garbrandt straight after that, until after that he got a submission win over Josh Fremd. He was actually scheduled to fight Bo Nickel at UFC 290 until he ended up getting pulled out from that fight, and since then this dude has just disappeared from the MMA world, hasn't been anywhere to be seen. Going to be taking on Antonio Trocoli, basically just known for being the boyfriend of Mackenzie Dern. That's basically his biggest accomplishment. Outside of that, he had a decent run outside the UFC. Had a couple of wins, had a couple of losses, got signed to the UFC on the Contender Series, had a no contest, got a win straight after that, and then immediately came back and had 3 scheduled fights. Was supposed to fight OSP, fell off. Was supposed to fight Umar C, that fell off too. Was supposed to fight Ikram Aliskerov, that all fell off until he got scheduled to fight Sharapute Magomedov, which actually went through at UFC, I think it was UFC Saudi Arabia, and he got finished by Sharapute Magomedov. Didn't do too bad in that fight, to be fair. He nearly took him down, and then Sharapute Magomedov grabbed the cage and didn't get punished for it. But he didn't do too bad in that fight until he eventually gassed out and got finished. In terms of who I'm picking to win, I'm picking Tresean Gore to win this one by TKO in the second round. How do you pronounce his name? Is it Gore or Gore? I've heard a couple of people pronounce it as Gore, and then some people pronounce it as Gore. I'm going to call him Gore. I think that sounds better. I don't want him to be called Gore. Sounds like some sort of dark web name, Gore. Anyway, yeah, I'm going to go Gore by TKO in the second round in this one. I think Gore's pretty good. Antonio Trocoli, what has he really done in the UFC? His biggest accomplishment is holding Sharapute Magomedov against a cage. He's a good striker. His jiu-jitsu isn't that, but I think Gore is probably the most fresh fighter, though. Not fresh in terms of activity, but he's a good wrestler. He's quite powerful on the feet. He isn't the best striker. I think on the feet, Antonio Trocoli takes it, but I think Tresean Gore is going to take him down. And basically just beat him with ground and pound. I don't think Trocoli's that good. Gassed out pretty quickly against Sharapute Magomedov. I'm going to go with Tresean Gore to win this one by TKO in the second round. It's a bit of a pick and fight, to be fair. There's not like an obvious winner in this fight. You could go either way. I'm leaning towards Gore winning this one. Come off a good submission win over Fremd, but you can go either way with this fight. I'm going to go with Tresean Gore. Then we have Romious versus Bolanos. Pretty good fight. Romious, I don't know what he's doing at the camera. I don't know why he's pulling that face to the camera. Before the UFC, had a decent run. Ended up going 7-1 outside the UFC. Comes over in the Contender Series, gets brutally knocked out in his Contender Series debut. Then he gets a win outside the UFC. Comes back to the Contender Series and gets another win. He's going to be taking on Bolanos, who is a Muay Thai champion. Had a decent run in Bellator as well. Had a lot of wins in Bellator. His last Bellator fight ended up getting a submission win. Comes over to the UFC, gets a win in his UFC debut by decision, and then he ends up losing to Mark McGee on the feet, but that's Mark McGee. The dude's going to be getting a ranked fight soon against Jonathan Martinez, so no shame in losing to him. In terms of who I'm picking to win, I'm going to go with Romious to win this one. I think Bolanos, despite having all these credentials in Muay Thai and kickboxing, I don't think he's that good, and his ground game is pretty bad as well. He showed in Bellator that he's got decent jiu-jitsu, but it's in Bellator. He's going to be taking a Romious, who is shown in the Contender Series that he's got a pretty good ground game. A little bit chinny, so he is capable of getting hit on the feet by Bolanos, who's very powerful. That's my only concern. But I feel like Romious is going to have a pretty easy time taking him down in this fight. And even on the feet, he's quite a powerful striker too. He's not like he's bad on the feet as well. He's on the feet, he's pretty good as well. So I'm going to be going with Romious to win this one by submission in the very first round. And then we have a short notice women MMA's fight between Melissa Mullins and Sygula. Melissa Mullins, she had a good run outside the UFC, 5-fight winning streak. Comes over to the UFC and so far she's 1-1 and didn't even do bad against Nora Cortavious, who she just recently lost to. Going to be taking on Sygula, who had a bit of a fraudulent record outside the UFC. She was fighting on these dodgy promotions. Her last win outside the UFC was, I think it was against a boxer. She's also had a couple of dodgy fights. She fought on like some sort of bare knuckle promotion too. Bit of a weird fight to break down. I'm going to go with Melissa Mullins to win this one by decision. Melissa Mullins is a pretty good grappler. She looked really good with her grappling in her UFC debut, and even in her last fight against Nora Cortavious, she was doing very well in that first round. I think she won that first round against Cortavious with the grappling. And like I said, this Sygula girl, I'm not really sure what she's done outside the UFC. She's got a bit of a dodgy record. She's fighting on these dodgy Polish promotions. I'm going to go with Melissa Mullins by decision. It's probably the safe lock. Good grappler. She was ranked as well after her first win in the UFC. I have no reason to pick Sygula to win this fight. She hasn't really been super active. She's not fought in any decent promotions. I'm going to go with Melissa Mullins to win this one by decision. And then we have Cody Stamann versus Damon Blackshear. Stamann, really good run outside the UFC as well. Absolute terror outside the UFC, to be fair. Comes over to the UFC. He had a bit of an up and down UFC career. Started off quite well, but then he recently fell off. Lost to some notable names as well. Lost to Marab, Said Nurmagomedov. Had a draw with Song Yudong and lost to Aljamain Sterling. So he isn't losing to absolute bums, but he's towards the end of his career. He's coming off 2 losses now. In a row as well. In his most recent loss coming to Taylor Lapillus, the big French prospect. He's going to be taking on Damon Blackshear, who also had a pretty decent run outside the UFC. I mean, it wasn't an absolute tear. Ended up losing to a couple of notable names in Chris Mutino and Pat Sabatini. Comes over to the UFC, loses his first fight to Farid Bashrat, and then has a draw as well to, what's his name? The Youssef Zalal, who's now on an absolute tear in the UFC. Then goes on a 2-fight winning streak by finish, and then recently lost to Mario Batista, which he could have won, and Mario Batista's now top 10, and got KO'd brutally by Montel Jackson, who is also in the rankings now. I think Damon Blackshear is a fairly good fighter. I think he's probably one of the best unranked bantamweights out there. I'm going to pick him to win this one by decision. I think Cody Stamann towards the end of his career, and I think Damon Blackshear is pretty skilled. He's good on the feet. He's got a good ground game. I don't think he's a better wrestler necessarily than Cody Stamann, but I think the jiu-jitsu of Blackshear is better. I also think he's going to do the better on the feet against Cody Stamann. Cody Stamann's towards the end of his career, and you know, you look at the guys that Damon Blackshear is losing to. He's losing to Farid Bashrat, big prospect. He lost to Mario Batista in a close fight, and he lost to Montel Jackson, who's a ranked fighter. So he isn't losing to bums. I think Cody Stamann's towards the end of his career. I'm going to go with Damon Blackshear to win this one by decision. I think he's going to basically just do better everywhere the fight goes. The only really big opportunity I see Cody Stamann winning this one is if he out-wrestles Damon Blackshear, which I think is quite unlikely. Anyway, then we have Charles Radtke versus Semelsberger. Matthew Semelsberger. Radtke, pretty good fighter outside the UFC. Had a couple of wins, 4-fight winning streak until he got to the UFC. Then he had his 2-fight winning streak in the UFC. Actually ended up grappling against Eric Anders outside the UFC until he fought Carlos Prates, the main event, and got brutally finished by Carlos Prates, like every single Carlos Prates victim does. Going to be taking on Matthew Semelsberger, who had, again, just an average run outside the UFC. Comes over to the UFC, ends up winning 4 out of his first 5, with his only loss being to Chaos Williams. And at the time, Chaos Williams was quite a good prospect, but now he's kind of fallen off. He's now lost 4 out of his last 5. He had a good win over Jake Matthews, which was kind of aged well, but he's now on a 3-fight winning streak as well. Matthew Semelsberger, he's quite young. He's only like 31, 32 years old, I'm pretty sure, but he is towards the end of his career, or at least he's out of his prime. I'm going to go with Charles Radtke to win this one by decision. I think Radtke's pretty talented. He's a decent striker, comes from a good team. He's pretty good everywhere the fight goes. Good wrestler, good striker, not particularly amazing everywhere, but it's Semelsberger. He got dominated by Preston Parsons. Medic finished him pretty bad as well. I just don't really know what's next for Semelsberger, to be fair. He's not been looking the most talented recently. I have no reason to really pick him over Radtke, who I think is going to piece him up on the feet for the majority of the fight. I even think he has a chance of knocking him out because Semelsberger is a very high-active, high-pressure type of fighter, and if you put him against someone like Charles Radtke, who's not the worst counter-puncher, I think Radtke can get this one done, but I'm going to go with Radtke to win this one by decision. Then we have Malik versus Todovoric. I mean, Malik, an absolute monster. This dude, I mean, before the UFC was on a 5-fight winning streak, all by way of KO. Came off a brutal KO in LFA. And he got a finish on the Contender Series as well, just to make things worse. He's got a record of 6-0 as well, and all 6 of his wins come by way of finish as well. This dude's an absolute monster. Going to be taking on Todovoric, who was a big prospect outside the UFC at one point on a big winning streak. Comes over to the UFC, coming off a win over Michel Pereira as well in his last fight before the UFC. Wins on the Contender Series, and then since then he's kind of had a bit of a bad run. I mean, to be fair, he is losing to the likes of Christine Leroy Duncan, Gregory Rodriguez by decision. which isn't that bad, but I think he's a bit of a fraud. I don't think he's that talented. I think he's only a couple of fights away from being cut from the UFC, and Malik looks like an absolute monster. I think he's going to be a problem. I'm going to go with Malik by TK on the third round. Looks really good in the Contender Series. Good striker, good grappler, very dangerous ground and pound as well. This dude's a beast. Todovoric, I mean, he's lost 3 out of his last 5, and even before that, he was on a bit of a losing streak as well. I'm going to go with Malik to take home in the very first round, and then we've got a rematch. Nicolas, Dalby, and Zaleski de Santos. These guys fought all the way back in 2015, both of their debuts, and Zaleski de Santos ended up getting Nicolas Dalby ended up getting a split decision win. In terms of who I think win this time, I mean, Nicolas Dalby, this dude, before the UFC, was on an absolute tear. Cage Warriors champion, then, like I said, beat Zaleski de Santos for his UFC debut. Ended up having a draw with Darren Till, then went on a 2-fight losing streak to get cut from the UFC after that. Then he went on a bit of a run in Cage Warriors. You know, went 3-0 in Cage Warriors with a no contest to tip it off, and then the UFC gave him an opportunity to come back, and so far he's had a decent run in the UFC. He lost to Tim Means, which is kind of a bad loss, and he also lost to Rinat Fakhretdinov, but even that loss to Rinat Fakhretdinov wasn't a bad loss. He's had some good wins in there, beating Bonfim by a finish, beating Muslim Salikov, Daniel Rodriguez. He's had some good finishes as well. Some good wins as well as Nicolas Dalby. Going to be taking on Zaleski de Santos, who basically just had an up and down UFC career. I mean, he lost to Nicolas Dalby, and then after that, he went on a bit of a tear. Ended up getting finished by Li Jingliang, and since that finish to Li Jingliang, he's not really been able to pick up momentum. Had a draw with Rinat Fakhretdinov, also had a close fight with Rinat Fakhretdinov, and lost his last fight to Randy Brown at UFC 302. I'm going to be picking Nicolas Dalby to win this one. I think Nicolas Dalby is one of the best unranked welterweights out there. He arguably beat Rinat Fakhretdinov as well. I mean, we know that Rinat Fakhretdinov's coming off a couple of dodgy wins, and I mean, a lot of people were arguing that Nicolas Dalby should have been able to beat Rinat Fakhretdinov. He's a pressure wrestler, is Nicolas Dalby. He's pretty dangerous on the feet as well, very powerful, not the most technical dude, but he's always in your face, pressuring you with either striking or wrestling. De Santos, he's a good striker, but he's not really been showing me much recently. Lost to Randy Brown, had a close fight with Rinat Fakhretdinov, lost to Muslim Salikov. I'm going to be going with Nicolas Dalby to win this one by decision as well. I mean, Santos is probably the better striker out of the two of them, but I feel like I'm well-rounded. I'm going to go with Nicolas Dalby. Then we have Pinheiro versus Gillian Robertson. Pinheiro, good run outside the UFC, ended up only losing 1 outside the UFC, gets a finish on the Contender Series, gets a 3-fight winning streak, looking like a promising prospect, but she has now lost her last 2, both by way of finish in the UFC. She's going to be taking on Gillian Robertson, who is a submission artist. 9 of her wins coming by way of submission. She's a dangerous grappler. She didn't have the best start to her UFC career, ended up going 1-1 on the Ultimate Fighter, and the first part of her UFC career was kind of bad, but recently, you know, from 2022 onwards, she's kind of changed her whole game around, and she is an absolute monster when it comes to grappling. I think she's probably one of the most entertaining women MMA fighters to watch from a grappling standpoint. Her takedowns are amazing. Her submission threats are amazing. And even that, a ground and pound. She knows what she's doing on the ground. She's either threatening submissions or beating you up. I mean, her recent fight that she had with Michelle Watterson-Gomez at UFC 303, she absolutely bullied Michelle Watterson-Gomez, gave one of the worst retirements you could possibly have in the UFC. And for that reason, I'm going to be picking Gillian Robertson. I'm going to say she gets it done by decision as well. I think Pinheiro's got good jiu-jitsu. I don't think she's going to get submitted by Gillian Robertson, but it doesn't even matter. Even if you've got submission defense, when you're facing Gillian Robertson, she's still got the ability to submit you, but even more importantly, she's got the ability to just absolutely batter people with the ground and pound. She's an absolute relentless grappler, very high-level grappler is Gillian Robertson, if I haven't told you already. I think on the feet, Pinheiro's probably better on the feet, but even then, she's not absolutely amazing on the feet. She's got good jiu-jitsu. She's not a bad striker, but I think Gillian Robertson is going to take it down and dominate her with grappling. And I think she's a good prospect for women MMA. So I'm going to say that really Gillian Robertson gets it done by decision. Then we have GM3 versus Derrida coming from 1FC. Now, GM3, I mean, this dude is an absolute monster when it comes to submissions, but he's just not really consistent. I mean, he's got 29 professional wins all by way of submission, which is absolutely crazy. This dude's got more submission wins than most, you know, MMA fighters do just fights alone. Absolute veteran of the game, has been competing in MMA since 2007, complete veteran in the UFC. The problem is he's not consistent. He's had so many losses in the UFC, it's quite hard to count. Now, there is a lot of notable names on there. Jack Hermansson, Kevin Holland, Chimaev by knockout, Joe Pyfer, Petrosky. So he's not like he's losing to absolute bums. He's also got some decent wins on his name as well. He's able to pick up a win. You put him against someone that's not really able to compete, and every single one of his wins in the UFC as well are by way of submission. So he's an absolute submission artist in the UFC as well, is GM3. He's had a couple of grappling matches, lost to Joe Pyfer in grappling, ended up having a grappling match with Craig Jones, one of the best grapplers out there, ended up losing to him too pretty quickly as well, but he's a good grappler is all you need to know about GM3, and he's coming off a 2-fight winning streak where he recently submitted Shabazi, and he's going to be taking on Derrida, who is also a good grappler with 12 wins by submission. And is, before 1FC, he was on a really good run, comes over to 1FC and basically takes over 1FC. Now, he is a double champion in 1FC, which is where most of his hype comes around. He's won 2 belts. One belt in 2 completely different weight classes simultaneously. But to be fair, he won the belt against the same guy and then ended up losing twice on 1FC. Got a win recently in a UAE Warriors, and now he's going to be coming back to face GM3 in the UFC. In terms of who I'm picking to win, I'm going to go with Derrida to win this one, but it's not like a super confident pick. I feel like people are looking at Derrida as if he's this new big prospect in the UFC. The dude lost his last 2 fights in 1FC. He won the belt against the same guy in 2 different weight classes to get the double champ status. GM3's a really good submission artist, and also he's Derrida. I'm picking Derrida purely because I think he's better on the feet, and I think his ground and pound ability is better. I think GM3's probably got the better pure jiu-jitsu and the better grappling, but I think Derrida's probably the more well-rounded martial artist, and he's shown in 1FC that he's fairly talented. I'm going with Derrida. I think he's probably the more comfortable pick here, but I don't think it's a super confident pick where I can look at Derrida and be like, yeah, this dude's going to, just blast through GM3. This ain't just some easy win for his UFC debut, but I do think he's going to finish GM3 within a couple of rounds, or at least get a decision win. Then we've got Ricky Turcios versus Sopaj. Ricky Turcios, he went on a decent run, then came to the Contender Series ages ago in the UFC. I think he was on the first Contender Series ever. I don't know if he's the first Contender Series ever, but it was one of the first Contender Series ever. Ended up losing on the Contender Series. Went 2-1 in his next 3 fights outside the UFC. Got an opportunity to fight on the Ultimate Fighter. Ended up winning on the Ultimate Fighter twice by decision. Ended up winning his UFC debut to Brady Highstand, which now Brady Highstand's a prospect. Well, not a prospect, but now Brady Highstand's in the UFC. That's kind of aged kind of well. And then in his past 3 fights, ended up going 1-2 in his past 3, but he lost to Raul Rosas Jr. and Ayman Zahabi, so it's not like he's losing to bums. I mean, Zahabi's now ranked, I'm pretty sure, so it isn't like he's losing to absolute cans. He's going to be taking on Sopaj, who was on a pretty decent run outside the UFC, looking like he was going to be a big prospect in the UFC, and then he suffered one of the most brutal losses of 2024 early this year, where he got knocked out brutally by Vinicius Oliveira. But to be fair, Vinicius Oliveira is probably one of the best unranked bantamweights out there. I'm going to pick Sopaj to win this one by decision. Ricky Turcios, he's got good jiu-jitsu, high output. That's pretty much all he's got going for him. He's not really that talented. I think Sopaj is more talented. I think Sopaj is a much better wrestler. And even in that fight with Vinicius Oliveira, he wasn't looking too bad. He was taking down Vinicius Oliveira and he was having success with the grappling in that first round. I think he's very powerful on the feet. I think he's got much better chance of finishing the fight than Ricky Turcios. The only problem with Sopaj is the gas tank. He looked very, very gassed in that fight with Vinicius Oliveira. And I feel like the best chance of Ricky Turcios getting a finish would be finishing him in that first round. I think he's going to go 2-1 Sopaj. Ricky Turcios wins the third. Sopaj wins the first 2. Potentially even gets a finish in the fight. But I'm going to keep it safe and go with Sopaj winning this one by decision. I just think he's got way more ways to win. And he's a better martial artist. Then we have Denise Gomez versus Kavulkiewicz. Kavulkiewicz, bit of a veteran to the game, actually a former KSW champion when she came into the UFC. Actually had experience against Yana Jędrzejczyk as well, a former champion in the amateur days. Ended up losing to her. Went on a 3-fight winning streak in the UFC, including a win over Rose Namajunas. Ended up actually fighting Rose Namajunas again for the belt. Lost that fight, and she's been super streaky since then. Went on a 2-fight losing streak, including a loss to Joanna Jędrzejczyk. Then she went on a 2-fight winning streak. Then she went on a massive 5-fight losing streak. But to be fair, she was losing to the likes of, Yang Xiaonan, Alexa Grasso, Jessica Andrade. And then then she went on a 4-fight winning streak, and she lost her last fight to Yasmin Lucindo. Going to be taking on Denise Gomez, who is a pretty scary striker for a women MMA fighter. 6 of her wins coming by way of finish. 67% of her wins come by way of knockout. Before the UFC, she lost her professional debut, then went on an absolute tear, most of them coming by way of finish. Ended up winning on the Contender Series as well. And then she went 1-3 in the next 3 fights, including one of the fastest finishers in, 1-2 in the next 3 fights. 2-1 in the next 3 fights, including one of the fastest finishes in women MMA history, where she finished Yasmin Jauregui in 20 seconds at UFC 290, brutally as well. Since then, she's gone 1-1, losing to Angela Hill and beating Mora. In terms of who I'm picking to win, I'm going to go with Denise Gomez to win this one by decision. I think she's just got way more ways to win. Grappling defense is going to be a big part of Denise Gomez's game in this fight, in my opinion. But she showed in her last fight that she's got decent grappling and takedown defense as well. And I think on the feet, it's completely night and day. I think she's a much more dangerous striker on the feet. I was actually originally going to pick her to win by stoppage, but then you realise it's women MMA. You can't really pick a women MMA fight to end by KO. But I'm going to go with Denise Gomez. I think she's the better striker, the better not merely a prospect, but the better up-and-comer. She's taking on a 40-year-old as well, even though she's a bit of a veteran. I think Denise Gomez has looked much better recently, and I think her takedown defense is going to hold up. I'm going to go with Denise Gomez by decision. Then we have the co-main event. Former champion Cody Garbrandt taking on Miles Johns. I mean, I don't really need to introduce you to Cody Garbrandt, former bantamweight champion, had one of the most dominating title performances of all time when he beat Dominic Cruz, and then he fell off. Had one of the worst chins in UFC history, suffered 4 knockouts in the UFC, not all in a row, but he still suffered 4 knockouts in the UFC. And then in his past 3, he's now 2-1, beat Brian Kelleher by finish, beat Tresean Jones, and lost to Deiveson Figueiredo at UFC 300. He's going to be taking on Miles Johns, who coming into the UFC was on a bit of a winning streak, comes into the UFC also with a win over Adrian Yanez, which is aged kind of well, won in the Contender Series, and then after that he's had a bit of an up and down career. It's been going fairly positive for Miles Johns. He's run into a couple of losses here and there. Cody Garbrandt's kind of flipped his career around, I want to say. In his last 3 fights, the UFC decided to give him a couple of cans. They decided to turn Cody Garbrandt into a bit of a can crusher after he lost to Kai France, and that's kind of worked out in his favour when he faced Tresean Jones and Brian Kelleher, because it seemed to sharpen up his skills. It's getting him that, not that he needs experience, but he's getting him that skill against lower level opponents to freshen him up, and it seems to have worked because he seems to be much more patient now. He had success against those guys, and even against Deiveson Figueiredo at UFC 300, he was looking good in that first round against Deiveson Figueiredo. I'm going to be picking Cody Garbrandt to win this one by decision. I'm going with no love by decision. I mean, knocking out Kelleher, I know Kelleher's a complete can. I'm not saying celebrate these wins are amazing, but like I said, even in that first round against Deiveson Figueiredo, he was looking good on the feet. I think he's the much better striker, and I still think Cody Garbrandt is like top 20 in the bantamweight division from like a skills standpoint. Obviously, I think the main problem with Cody Garbrandt is obviously his chin. You crack him with a big shot and he's done for. And I also think the competition has, evolved massively since Cody Garbrandt's run in the bantamweight division. But he's taken on Miles Johns, who is a step up from Brian Kelleher and Tresean Jones, and he's definitely got an opportunity to win this fight. But from a skills perspective, I think they're miles apart. I think the only real opportunity Miles Johns have of winning this fight is if he cracks Cody Garbrandt with a big shot. So I'm going to go with Cody Garbrandt to win this one by decision. I think from a skills perspective, he's still very talented. He looked good in that first round with Figueiredo. Unless he gets caught by a big shot and knocked out, which is a big if, I'm going to pick him to win by decision. Still very skilled. And then we've got the main event, Neil Magny versus Carlos Prates. Perfect main event to have Neil Magny in the main event of an Apex card for the 100th celebration of the card. Neil Magny, I mean, I'm not going to go through his entire career because this dude's been in the UFC for so long, since 2012. He's been in the UFC and he's been very active at that as well. I think Neil Magny is the most inconsistent gatekeeper in the UFC. That's the perfect way you can describe Neil Magny. I mean, if we just take a look at his past couple of fights, goes on a 2-fight winning streak, ends up getting submitted by Shavkat Rakhmonov, then he ends up beating Daniel Rodriguez by finish, then ends up getting finished by Gilbert Burns, then he ends up beating Phil Rowe by decision, then he loses to Ian Gary by decision, then he ends up finishing Mike Mallet, then he ends up getting finished by Marco Morales. This dude is one of the most inconsistent fighters in the UFC, and it's, I mean, maybe the streak's going to show up, and maybe he manages, because of the streak, to get a win over Carlos Prates, who's an absolute beast. Now, we didn't have the best start to his MMA career. Carlos Prates was fighting in promotions like ONE FC, and his grappling kind of got exposed, but since then, he kind of turned into a completely different fighter. He's now on a massive winning streak, most of them coming by way of finish as well. He's an absolute beast. Trains out of the Fighting Nerds, one of the best gyms in the UFC, what it seems to be right now, and he's coming off a couple of brutal finishes. Like I said, Charles Radtke by finish, absolutely butchered Li Jingliang at UFC 305, and he seems to be one of the best striking prospects right now in the welterweight division. In terms of who I'm picking to win, even though the Neil Magny curse is kind of making me want to go towards Magny, I'm going to go with Carlos Prates by KO in the second round, but it's not like it's a super confident pick. Obviously, I'm still going to go with Prates by finish because he's an absolute monster of a striker. But I can definitely see Neil Magny being the guy that's going to potentially throw check Carlos Prates like he did with Mike Mallet. Like, if Neil Magny comes in with a very grappling offensive game plan, holds Carlos Prates against the cage and just out-grapples him, I think he's got a good opportunity of doing that because Prates isn't a good grappler. On top of that, he's a 5-rounder. Neil Magny's got way more experience than Carlos Prates. For all we know, Prates might be terrible in 5-rounders, so there's a lot of questions that are going to be answered in this fight. And it is the biggest fight for Carlos Prates so far, but the way that he completely dismantled Li Jingliang on the feet, and he's training with the Fighting Nerds, a gym that I'm sure are going to be taking care of his grappling, I've just got to go with Carlos Prates to win this one by KO in the second round. I'm not going to be mad if Neil Magny wins because he's going to be turning into one of the funniest gatekeepers in the UFC if he actually gets this one done, but you've just got to go with Carlos Prates to win this one. Big prospect in the welterweight division, relentless, just ruthless striker on a massive winning streak of just pure finishes, so I'm going to go with Carlos Prates to beat Neil Magny by KO in the second round. But those are my predictions and breakdowns for UFC Vegas 100, the 100th event in the Apex. Let me know your thoughts on this card and your personal predictions. Thank you for watching.